Welcome back to the Movement Professional Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Chris Leib. Today we're joined once again by a returning guest and true expert in the world of integrated physical therapy, Dr. Frank Mallon of Renaissance Physical Therapy. Frank is a Postural Restoration Institute certified clinician with years of experience helping patients bridge the gap between biomechanics, neurology, and respiration. If you caught our previous episodes, you already know how deep Frank's knowledge runs, and today we're diving even deeper. In this episode, we focus on PRI's foundational concept as they relate to the pelvis and hips. We unpack what it really means to restore position before movement, how asymmetry drives compensations, and why pelvic and hip mechanics are central to everything from chronic pain to athletic performance. Whether you're a clinician, coach, or just curious about how your body works, this conversation will give you a fresh perspective on alignment, function, and long-term health. Let's get into it. Welcome back to the Movement Professional Podcast. I'm joined again by Dr. Frank Mallon of Renaissance Physical Therapy. Good to have you back again, Frank.
Hey, Chris, good to be back. Thanks for having me.
So Frank's in the office now, doing a little work, with me, and that's great because Frank, he's really like a leader and an expert in the field, and I was like getting his perspective on things. When he's been on the podcast before, we've talked mostly about PRI, the Postural Restoration Institute, where Frank's an expert in that. I think, are you still the only certified PRC in Pennsylvania?
No, there's some others now.
A couple now.
Yeah,
I know you're the original, though, the OG. So we had spoken in the past about dentation and jaw position, TMJ mechanics, how that plays a role in chronic pain presentations or just things that you typically see in a physical therapy clinic. I think we also spoke about and how vision plays a role. Today, what I'd like to touch on is more this is the first piece of PRI that I learned was about the pelvis and the hips and also like the core area, kind of the lower center, if you will, and how that's all integrated with breathing. Because that's where I feel like I still use the mechanics the most, or I just feel like you get the biggest bang for your buck if you kind of get that right. And everything else up and around the chain kind of works pretty well. So I think it kind of like can tie into some of the even athletic movements that we all know and kind of can speak a common language about. So my intention, and I was telling you before we got on, is this with the PRI stuff. Some people know nothing about it, so if we can kind of just bring some education to what we mean when we refer to Postural Restoration Institute and their methods, but also the people that do know about it, sometimes they just haven't gone deep enough, and they, on the surface, sometimes it can seem a little bit esoteric and unnecessary, but where we find it valuable and how it's absolutely foundational, and we can kind of demystify maybe some of the things that are around it. That would be the goal with all of these conversations. But I'm hoping this one really gets to the core of it, because I do think we can really talk about some very specific examples of where they tie into, common human movement.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the main primary foundational concept that all of PRI is really built around is the fact that as humans, we are not symmetrical. And if we took each person, regardless of what has happened to you in your life, but every human being on this planet, if we split them down the center and we look at either side of their body, there are obviously all different neurologic asymmetries as far as certain hemispheres of the brain handle different pieces of information that connect to different sides of the body. And you can go deep into the software programming of it. But if we just look at the mechanical aspect of it, our main source of sustaining life, which is our diaphragm muscle, is asymmetric in and of itself.
Right.
And that is that has to do with the presence of certain organs that you have on one side of your body that you don't have on the other. You have, more lobes of a lung on one side than you have on another. The heart is positioned more over to one side. The liver is all on one side, and it's our bodies, and then the diaphragm itself is different on both sides. And it means that one side of the diaphragm is better positioned mechanically in order to help handle inhalation, and another side ends up kind of getting stuck in a little bit of a compromised state that lends it susceptible to staying in a contracted state, or a state of inhalation. And also, the diaphragm attaches differently to the lumbar spine. And if you have one side that's contracted more than the other, it lends itself, and if it's positioned in a way where it can kind of pull forward because it's in that descended, contracted, inhaled state, it can leave you susceptible to some orientation changes in the lumbar spine and some compensatory patterns that can emerge around the pelvis. And another thing is that diaphragm is also interdigitating with the psoas muscle as it comes off the lumbar spine. So so a lot of people are well aware that they might have a psoas that's always tight. And they go and they get massages and they get in there and they go, oh man, your psoas is tight, you need these psoas stretches. And if and other people who are deeper into the esoteric stuff might also realize that they have traumas that get stored in that psoas and that kind of stuff. But if we're just talking mechanics, if you have a psoas that is hooked up to a diaphragm that is perpetually in a contracted state and is not well encapsulated within the boundaries of the core, so to speak, which include the ab wall on the front and sides, the rib cage around it, and the pelvis and that pelvic floor underneath, then it really leaves you susceptible to that pelvis starting to rotate, or that lumbar spine kind of preferring a certain orientation. And then it makes it likely that just the way that you are breathing is keeping you stuck in that state. So for someone who maybe goes to the chiropractor periodically and they go, oh yeah, my pelvis is always twisted. They always say that this one side is a little bit higher or a little bit more forward than the other. What we try to do is we say, okay, well, let's address those imbalances in the muscles that kind of got swept up into this, because now the way that you're breathing is really perpetuating this whole domino effect of muscle contraction activity throughout the chains of your core, pelvis, and hips that are kind of keeping you stuck in this pattern. So we can keep putting you back in place. The chiropractor or whoever's working on you, the massage therapist or whoever, can keep saying, okay, we lined you up, now you're good, go back to life. But if you're still in those same patterns and strategies for movement, by the time you get to your car, you might be quote unquote out again,
Right.
and so there's a lot of different patterns around this. We're not all doing it the same way. Okay. And there's a lot, and I think that's part of why some people will try to throw arrows at PRI and saying that we assume that everyone needs the same program. And that's really not the case. The more comprehensive you dig into the learning of what postural restoration is about. I mean, there's hundreds, close to thousands of exercises in a PRI program. So if we all needed the same couple of things, then it would be easy for us to just meet someone once and say, okay, here's your, and it would fix everybody. But really, we have to look at all the intricacies of how that diaphragm and that psoas are influencing someone's pelvis and hips, because for some people it ends up looking like this, but other people maybe have certain things going on in their connective tissue or certain things just by their genetics. Sometimes people have certain traumas that have happened along the way, or certain surgeries that have been done in other places that have caused them to not be a quote unquote clean slate human. And we have to account for them, and we have to understand the details of how to address where their body is preferring and how to inhibit those strategies in order to kind of rewire things. So, it's the main thing, though, if we really look at it, is if this is our pelvis and we have, say, for instance, a left diaphragm that is a little bit more contracted on one side and it's not able to go kind of in that full up and down excursion of a purely respiratory strategy, it'll start to become in this contracted state more of a postural muscle. And what we mean by that is as it's contracted, it starts to, instead of moving up and down, starts to pull things forward. And so if that left side starts to get forward, it means it's going to be easy for that left side of the rib cage to want to lift up. And those abs on that left side to become a little bit compromised in certain core muscles. But it also means that underneath it, now this psoas is kind of starting to behave badly. It's not well disciplined by the borders of what a proper core should be. And that's that ab wall in the front, ribs that come down and slightly in a relaxed state can rest over in front of parts of that diaphragm to kind of make sure that it keeps moving up and down. But once those ribs lift up, now that guy doesn't have the discipline to stay up in here, and now it's coming forward, which means that psoas is very much more contracted and thus not disciplined itself. So just in this example, if that is here, we're going to basically now have a sacrum that orients to the right side. We're going to have a pelvis on the right side that likes to live in a posterior type of orientation. And now at the hips, as this guy comes more this way, this left femur is going to kind of, in an effort to stay in the hip capsule, is going to end up being like this. But we won't walk around like this because otherwise we would catch that left toe when we walk. So the body then compensatorily will learn to externally rotate this left hip. And so that can leave you susceptible to any number of things. So for some people, they end up overstretching this anterior hip capsule on the left. For some people, they end up maybe getting too stiff and tight in the back part of this aspect. And maybe they get an issue of femoral ligament that gets tight, or maybe they start to get a tighter piriformis on this side and it starts to pinch down on that sciatic nerve that runs down the back of the leg. It can manifest in any number of ways. We could go down the chain, and it could also cause maybe that left foot to have to live in a little bit more of extra pronation, et cetera. So there's a lot of ways in which this can manifest in the body. We don't really, as PRI providers, if someone is coming in for a specific diagnosis and they say, oh yeah, it's left plantar fasciitis, or it's left sciatica, or it's X, Y, or Z, pick a diagnosis that would be a more traditional one. I don't know what we're going to do with that person, because we got to look at the pattern of why they're maybe impinging on that area too much. And so we treat not even just a ubiquitous pattern, because that doesn't even tell us enough about what that person needs, but it's all the details and compensations within that pattern that make each PRI program unique, because we have to figure out, and this is one thing I try to stress, is I'm not treating the pattern with you. I'm treating your version of these patterns that your body has learned, because everybody's version is different and there's a lot of variables that go into that. But I think that really this is a base concept that anybody who's working with movement, with hips, with pelvis issues, having an understanding of how your unconscious respiratory habits could be influencing and predisposing you to some preferred patterns, and some preferred positions that may even just be, as contributing to why you like to sit a certain way, or why your hips like to hang out a certain way when you drive, or those types of things, can all be relevant. And that's where we look to intervene in saying, how do we make sure that we don't allow these preferred habits to just kind of like snowball and run amok. And so we try to empower the clients with techniques to kind of neutralize what becomes a cumulative effect of you doing something the same way every day, just because unconsciously that's how your body got used to doing it because it got tied to your respiratory pattern.
Absolutely. And I think like one of the ways that I've sort of viewed this over time is like when you first learn some of these concepts, it's sort of like you get puzzle pieces, but you haven't seen the complete puzzle yet. And I think that's also why you get some resistance from some people is they've taken, whether it's on social media or just in what they've seen from other people or heard from other people, they take some of the puzzle pieces, but they don't have the complete picture yet. And ultimately, the way that I kind of look at it, certainly not the complete picture, but a little bit more holistic picture, is that there's an assumption of asymmetry, which makes actual intuitive sense when you question people on the idea of being symmetrical, you find out really quickly that like that assumption just doesn't make sense for how we live our lives, right? From a use standpoint, but also just like when we start questioning the internal anatomy, like you so eloquently described, like it's just how many things are naturally asymmetrical in the body. Then just starting from that perspective that it's not wrong to be asymmetrical. It would be weird if you weren't. But then appreciating that like we all do have a certain maybe consistency to some of the patterns that we might unconsciously fall into. So like that's another like broad concept. But ultimately, like the thing that makes the most sense to me is that what we're actually able to do then is get this sense of loading aside if we want to load it more and unloading aside if we want to load it more. And that is just like basic movement, right? Like that's what we do with walking. That's what we do with cutting. And it was never described that way to me in school like because everything we do in orthopedics, at least in school, is it's like breaking it down to like what does a joint do in isolation and like what do isolated joints do when you take it out of the context of movement. Like you start to forget that we have to respond to gravity over and over again, and we kind of like look at respiration as this pure like gas exchange thing that is just like keeping us alive and not really appreciating that there's a postural and a muscular element to that and internal forces that are being generated that are always we have control over. I think that's the biggest thing, right? Because a lot of people are like, I'm already breathing. Well, yes, but you have control over how you breathe, which you also have control over how you move force through your body. And I just think like that becomes the bigger picture when you start seeing more of the puzzle pieces together. It's a pretty complex jigsaw puzzle, but like there's a lot of pieces that you need to put together. But ultimately, once you get a handle for all the pieces, what you're looking to do is give people more control of how they shift weight.
Yeah.
And breath is part of that.
Yeah.
Your tongue position is part of that. Your jaw position is part of that. But it ultimately, if it comes back to that, it's like, okay, it makes sense. Like your right side hurts maybe more because you're putting more weight on your right side. So if we just focus on the area that hurts, we don't do anything to teach you how to shift weight, hold weight differently, then we're probably not going to get very far with that. But if we just have that basic concept of like, our goal is to get you to be more in control of how you shift weight. Now all of these techniques come to play. But the techniques are like, I rarely use a PRI technique that I've seen in the manual because I take the concept and put it into something that makes more sense for the person in front of me or it into something that they find maybe a little bit more meaningful. But the techniques themselves they're beautiful, but they're like you said, they're plentiful. Like so they don't mean as much as the concepts themselves mean. And then it's just like ultimately it's an education for the client to say, can you feel this concept in your body? And here's all of the indications that you're feeling it right. Yeah. And there are certain exercises in gravitational positions that allow you to feel it better early on. But ultimately, we're trying to just have you feel it with things that matter to you.
Yeah, we are. Yeah, it's said beautifully. And I explain to people all the time that our bodies are pressure regulating systems. And that pressure comes in through all these symptoms, all these systems. It's like absolutely you said, it's the respiratory, the lymphatic, the cardiovascular, all these types of things. It's areas of the pelvis that need to shift and manage pressure through our pelvic inlets, which is this part up here, and our pelvic outlets. And the position of this affects how well we're going to be able to get that diaphragm up inside you to function as a respiratory muscle. And it's almost like, think of the diaphragm as like a plunger in a toilet, right? And when you get that suction right, you get that proper plunge effect, right? But if you don't line it up right with the bowl around it, where you have that plunger and you snip a hole in it with some scissors, a slit along one side, now it loses that plunger effect. And so, if you don't have a rib cage that's positioned well with a pelvis underneath it, then we lose the plunging pressure regulating effect of our main pressure regulator, which is that diaphragm. And there's everybody's, I'm sure, listening to this is well aware of the whole soda can analogy, right? Before you open a soda can, there's a lot of pressure in there. But once you poke a hole in it, you pop the lid, you can crush that can, no problem. And so our bodies, if we look at our bodies as a soda can, with the bottom of that can being the pelvic floor, and the top end of that can being the glottis of the throat here, and then all that whole cylinder around it being the chest wall and the pelvis and the ab wall, anytime there's compromise to that, it's going to affect our ability to manage pressure. So you take someone who just had a C-section, and now all of a sudden they have headaches or jaw pain or obviously pelvic floor problems, right? That's pressure regulated issues. And that can happen any number of ways. But I often tell people, you might be here for back pain, or you might be here for knee pain or hip pain, but you don't have a bad side and a good side. It's the harmony between both sides that needs attention. It's the ability to compress properly while the other side is decompressing, and then reverse that when you go to the other leg, so that you can evenly, in a harmonious, optimal biomechanical way, get that reciprocal transition and alternation through the pelvis. And what you're here for, that ICD-10 diagnosis that might say sciatica or patellofemoral pain or plantar fasciitis or whatever it is, that's the consequence of the pressure mismanagement, of that lack of harmony and reciprocation that our bodies need in order to help manage and offset the internal asymmetries that exist in every system of the body. Pick a system of the body, there's asymmetry in it, and that's and I'll die on that hill, right? Whether it's neurologic, cardiovascular, lymphatic, digestive, respiratory, you name it. We are not identical on right and left, and our body's actually well designed when functioning properly to be able to manage that and to be able to offset how those asymmetries kind of leave us susceptible to certain things. But in our modern lives, we don't tend to activate those mechanisms as much as maybe our ancestors did. So then when certain preferential patterns and states kind of emerge and stay persistent, and we layer onto that life stresses and certain positions and maybe lack of certain activities that we used to do as humans, or you throw into that extra inflammation in our systems and our environments, it allows some of these patterns to kind of emerge, and when unchecked, that can show up as any kind of diagnosis there is.
Right. Absolutely. No, and I think it's like, I like to think of it as there is the what, like people want to know what's going on, like, and sometimes the where is connected to the what, but then there is the with what, like what are your symptoms coming on, or when do they come on? What provokes them? So with what brings them on? Because that's where I think this big puzzle is, like, we can get people better at the with what, and there's usually some type of efficiency in whatever it is. Like, it hurts when I walk, it hurts when I get up, it hurts when I squat. whatever that movement is, that's the complaint, the with what, there's usually some type of inefficiency that is tied into unconscious patterning. And, that unconscious patterning is not like we're, being led around by ghosts. It's just like, it's normal. It's normal. Like we're not conscious of what we're doing all the time. That is a healthy, normal thing. If we were conscious of it, then we'd be paralyzed. Right. So there is like this normality to asymmetry. And there's also that we're not conscious to what we're doing too much of all the time. So a symptom, in my estimation, is sort of just the body finally telling you we got to change something.
Yeah.
And when we have to change it, it's like what I've found so much value in with the PRI system, and then connected to some other systems that have this sort of idea of like pressure is sort of king or queen, right? It's like we're trying to manipulate pressure as more than we're trying to like mitigate damage or something like that. And when somebody is usually feeling a symptom, whether it's numbness, pain, it's usually like a pressure that is getting, for lack of a better way to say it, like stuck in an area longer than we want it to and not dispersed well enough throughout the body. So this big puzzle that comes together really gives us a nice framework for showing people how to balance pressures better in their body, which then leads to things like alternation, reciprocal motion. And oftentimes, like, I know as a therapist now, I look at the body more of like, is this person alternating well? Are they reciprocally moving well or not? Where I didn't really have that mentality at all. It would be like, no, the diagnosis of a knee is like, my focus was on the knee, as opposed to whether it's the knee, the hip, the ankle, like even up in the shoulders, like where is there a problem with alternation? Or the other side of that, you see some people that just get over by force in the world. Like they're weak. You can call them weak, and they can't hold their position when resistance comes to them. So that's another manifestation in many ways of not being able to like manage the forces and the pressures of life. Right. And the very physical pressures we're talking about of life, but like the emotional pressures, then they actually start to make sense with how they fit into movement. Right. Because they will create a change in respiration. They'll create a change in circulation patterns. All of that is like well documented in like that's normally how systems work in the body. But for some reason, when we talk about that from a physical therapy perspective, we're talking out of turn in some ways. Like we should just be like putting ankle weights on people and moving in very linear planes. Like we shouldn't talk about like how emotion and psychology like has a very well documented patterning of how like you breathe differently, how you hold tension in your body differently, and then that will show up differently in your ability to reciprocally move or be stiff and walk around like you just deadlifted.
Yeah.
Right. So all of these things are connected.
I think you're and you know what. Yeah, couple of really cool points that you made there. Like if you talk about like, the pressure is getting trapped somewhere. I tell people, I use the analogy of a water balloon all the time, right? So if you have a water balloon and you squeeze one end of it, obviously the other end is going to bulge. And a lot of times that's the end where you're coming in with pain because of, right? Mm-hmm. So the nice thing about when you look at it this way is you start to get, an appreciation for, if we zoom out and we look at this whole system, right? Maybe the problem is not where the bulge is. Maybe the problem is where the clamps are. And the nice thing about it is it's a lot of times easier to take the clamps off the other end of that water balloon. And then this bulge shrinks. And it doesn't now cause someone to exceed their tissue tolerance of, inflammation and all that kind of stuff, right? And 100%. So it can be a nice way of attacking these frustrating problems for people because you use the ankle weights, right? Like in the traditional world, you got to get stronger. We got to strengthen your core. We got to start from zero, and we got to work our way up a little bit, right? And then, but all the while, if we're fighting that bulged end of the water balloon, first off, it's going to be a much bigger uphill battle. But the nice thing about some of these techniques is someone can say, oh, when I feel X in this part of my body, which is my problem, I know that probably means I need to do Y. And it may mean that, oh, when I feel my right knee hurting, I know it's because I have to do this specific stretch in my left hip. And then by doing that left hip stretch, now the right knee just falls into place beautifully. As opposed to if that right knee being the bulge end of the water balloon, we're trying to get the tibial rotation, we're trying to get the glute, we're trying to stretch the hamstring, all this stuff, right? Sometimes you got to look being able to see what's really dysfunctional and why that pressure is congregating in that bulge in that other way. And you're absolutely right that one of the things that always perplexed me, right, is people would say, well, I told my doctor about this problem or that problem, and they just told me it's stress. And I go, oh, okay, right? Well, it's just stress, right? Well, you know what? There's a lot of people in life experiencing stress, but why is it that the stress for you shows up this way while the stress, there's a lot of people that are stressed in the world that don't have this specific problem, right? So examine why the sympathetic fight or flight response of environmental stress or whatever it is having this cascade for you, because I guarantee you that doctor's not wrong, that it's relevant that when your body's under that fight or flight. But let's look at the physiologic, like you said, well-documented cascade of what normal human healthy bodies do under those circumstances to be able to then intervene at why this stress for you is showing up as this problem in your body, because you're not crazy. There's things to do about it. And your body is doing exactly what normal human healthy bodies do under these circumstances. So let's give you the tools to identify how these circumstances are showing up physiologically. It's not all in your head. You're not crazy. It's your human healthy body. It's normal. So let's give you the tools to be able to recognize it and intervene in ways that help regulate your system so that the presence of this stress, maybe it's a stressful call with, a spouse or, somebody in your family or your boss or whatever it is. But let's examine why that cascade, why those dominoes start knocking down and it causes this to happen at your neck or this to happen in your back or whatever. And let's give you the tools to address that so that you have defense mechanisms in place rather than going, oh man, doctor told me to stress. I hope I don't get stressed today because then I know I'm going to feel this symptom, whatever.
Absolutely. And I just think sometimes the healthcare practitioners will use a term like you're stressed as a throwaway comment to it's not wrong. It's just that we could do better as healthcare practitioners with applying, giving more of a guide. So this is what stress can manifest in the body physically. So yes, you're stressed. We get stressed. The stress goes up and down. What's a balance for that? And again, why is it manifesting in a specific way in your body that might be different than someone else? But those manifestations tend to be where the pressure is greatest or is being stunted the most in someone's body that is based on their structure, based on their genetics, based on different things. But a lot of times the circulation patterns that you would expect to see, the respiration patterns that you would expect to see at the epitome of a sympathetic fight or flight response versus the epitome of the parasympathetic rest and digest response, we know those sort of endpoints. And we know sort of the patterning that things can, there's a general direction that stuff's moving. And then we can see, all right, where is that manifesting for you? And what general direction can we move? Maybe that's away from that. Yeah. And then I just think we have more tools in our box now for those type of complaints that when I was a younger therapist, I would kind of dismiss it too. It would be that's not my scope of practice. In a way, whereas you need a psychologist, where it's you still might, but I'm understanding more of the physical manifestations of this stress response that is very obvious that you see, and it's very documented, things with chronic pain, whether you want to label them as fibromyalgia or just specific chronic pain patterns, they tend to correspond to, or they're connected to troubles with psychology, sleep, history, trauma. All of those things tend to go hand in hand. And we, instead of trying to eliminate them from our consciousness, we want to understand them, what's the commonalities there. And then once you start appreciating that and you have things that you can actually do about it, you look forward not to the person struggling, but you look forward to helping that person, because now you don't have to dismiss it. Now you can do something about it, or at least you have a bit of a roadmap to say, this actually makes more sense to me where all these pieces fit together. And then the other thing I'll say is like, we're having sort of a conversation using our language around this and some of the language that we've learned. I mean, sometimes language is the problem, in that when we're trying to get people to move, it's not a language of words. It ends up being a language of feel. Mm-hmm. And that's the other thing I've really like appreciated is like, I have to change my words. Is a useful feeling for a person, but it's ultimately trying to get someone to the same place. Like I want to get them where they currently can't go, but a lot of times the language isn't there yet, right? Like the understanding isn't there. So, but there's certain muscle feels or pressure feels, like being able to change pressure, be able to feel a muscle contract in a way they couldn't. That is a reference and an indication that they've done something that is moving them in the direction that we want them to go. And then that starts to become, like you mentioned, the inlet and the outlet of the pelvis. So if somebody is not watching this on YouTube, just like, I like to think now, if I'm like having an effect on the inlet, it might be like across my front belt, on an exhale that I'm creating a little bit of pressure change or tension there. Might feel like, like a lower core. The back, the outlet to me feels like I've stretched out or I've opened up my back pocket, right? Like these become feelings for people that I'm like, do you feel your back pocket? Do you feel, these areas that tells me that they're moving in a direction that they currently weren't moving in the past, and especially around the hips and the pelvis, that's all they need to know, right? It's like, can you feel this back pocket in a way that you couldn't feel before? You know what I mean? And that becomes like how we're connecting all those dots or putting all those puzzle pieces together to get to the whole.
Yeah, Chris, I think that you're absolutely right, because when I look back at when I was a young therapist, and you get that intake form of this new patient you're going to see, and they'd have everything checked off, and you go, oh, they got this neck pain, and they got anxiety, oh no, and they got depression, and they got GI problems, and they got acid reflux, and they got this, and I go, oh my God, what am I going to do? Now I look at that and I go, of course they got anxiety.
Of course, exactly.
Of course they got depression. And of course they got this. I expect everything to be checked off because, it's like, okay, let's get after it then. And those are the people that I find that this can be really powerful stuff for, because, I guarantee you, they've already seen the best doctor in all those departments in the Philly area, right? They've already seen the top people at the health systems for X, Y, and Z issues. And, it's nice to be able to give these people an understanding of kind of like how the dysregulation of their system has caused this ripple effect into all these different areas. And here's how we can go about that. And there's a lot of strategies we can do it. And I don't know what we're going to do with a person just by looking at that intake form. We got to assess them and see how they, what their story is and how they got here and things that have happened along the way and how they're presenting now. But being able to give people that reassurance of, no, you're not crazy. It makes sense to me that as to how we got here, right? And so let's just start shrinking this onion and try to get some of these systems back online together. Because really, we got a bunch of different things suffering the consequences of the lack of harmony in this internal system. And what you're experiencing externally is a lot of times the consequence of your internal dysregulation. And that can come both mechanically, and neurologically, of course, but it's tough to separate those pieces.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I was like, I remember the first course I took for PRI, it was about the pelvis, and we sort of talked about like all the muscles and we colored them in, which was fun, but it like kind of got the image in your head. And like the way that I had originally learned anatomy, this was very different. So like learning, not that the muscles were different, it was just like the use of the muscles was very different. So again, that's like the puzzle piece feel. So like specifically, and I can even use this now in my own head and as a reference for just, if we're thinking about like the right side and when we want to get off the right side, the right glute max was discussed as a very important muscle for that. And it carries over to other things. And at that time, I didn't really get it, but I was just like, I'll color it in and I'll understand it later. The upper hamstring, the proximal hamstring, that like right at the attachment on the left side, is a muscle that kind of like gets you to compress towards the side, brings you towards the side. in her thigh on that side, or in another course, it was like almost like a feeling of a pinch in the socket. So there's all of these muscles that we still will look to have as references for a change of position and a change of like how one is holding their body. That if you just treat them in isolation, then they don't work in the same way as understanding that they're references for the change of load, change of position, change of posture. But that posture isn't right. It's just like something that your body wasn't getting to well. And it's not like easy to get to. So like you can't just say like, do it different. We actually have to give people like muscular cues, pressure cues, right? So we can use like the sit bone when you're sitting on one side versus the other. What side are you putting more pressure into? Just that the reference of awareness. And anytime you use the word awareness, it ties into a very physiological principle called proprioception, right? The ability to sense position, which can be traced back to a very specific part of the spinal cord, right? So like, all of this stuff, none of it's esoteric. When it has anatomical structures, it's just not going to be something that has an ICD-9 code to say like your proprioception is a little bit shitty on your left side. Well, it's like, and how do we know it's better? Because you can feel things better, right? And how do we know you feel things better? Because we asked you to, and before you had a harder time, now you have an easier time, right? Like, but it's a process that you have to slow down. We have to kind of understand like why we're doing something. But these muscles are less about strengthening, in my opinion, and it's more about referencing a position. But then you also get stronger because if you can contract a muscle easier, then you usually can change your position easier. And it all tends to work together, which then means you can mitigate pressure easier and you can change your pain easier. And I still remember, if we're talking about the hips today, those are like your basic things, like right glute max, left hamstring, left inner thigh, left ab, like all of those things together, like it really does work. And then when you actually understand kinematics and like mechanics of how a muscle contraction will change the position of the attachment at the bone, it changes, if you get it all right, it really does make you move differently, and it makes you position differently, and you hold stress differently, and you engage with the world and gravity differently.
You're absolutely right. The muscles of our body do not operate in silos. They function in a chain, like a domino effect, right? And I tell people all the time, if we want to light up the house, we don't want you to have to run around to each room and turn on every lamp, right? We want to go down to the switch box and just hit one number and the whole thing lights up. And really that's what walking and movement and shifting weight and reciprocation and all that should be. And, it might sound like basic and elementary and, but I mean, there's times where I've worked with, defensive linemen in the NFL, and we challenge the heck out of them without even putting a band in their hand or even a weight in their hand. And we get these muscles to show up in synchronicity. And I'll get text messages the next day. Hey, I just had one of the strongest lifts I've had in years, right? So just by us positioning that pelvis, getting some of these muscles to fire at the same time, again, it's more sequence and timing and inhibition in certain cases to keep everything in check and lined up, which is no easy task. And it can exponentially increase your body's pressure regulation. And then all of a sudden, like you said, you just get stronger, So, so these are concepts that are really helpful and valuable, regardless of what your population is. It could be, grandmom who just needs to get to the mailbox, and it could be someone who's, playing in the NFL on Sundays. And I, work with the whole continuum, and I rarely ever touch a weight, or the band, because it's like, we got to give you the foundation to kind of fill in the cracks. And so that you then become stronger and more stable. And then at that point, then fine, go ahead and work out, do whatever, get stronger. But let's make sure that we're not showing up to that game or that workout in this twisted strategy, because your body loses a lot of inefficiency, both in its strength and musculoskeletal position and power, but also from a neurologic perspective, because it puts extra strain on the body, and body will become more sympathetically driven as it feels like it has to cling to just these couple of channels that it knows well without the support of the whole show.
Perfect. Well, Frank, I know you got a heart out, you got a patient. I want to do a part 2 of this, discussing more about pressure, because I think like we're on to a good discussion there about like pressure for strength training, but also just the idea of like how we can use some of these concepts to like make someone feel heavier, right? Like if you want to get stronger, you got to feel heavy, right? But also like the opposite. If you want to like have more endurance, sometimes you have to like actually get your body to feel lighter and more efficient. And I think we're just kind of scratching the surface on how these concepts at the hips and throughout the body help with those broad principles of like, do you want to be strong? Like, how do you feel pressure to create more heaviness? If you want to be, have more efficiency and endurance, then how do you kind of get yourself to be lighter and shift weight better? So I think we'll save that for maybe next couple of weeks.
That'd be fun. I appreciate it. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Frank.